Hello and welcome to the Evelyn Y. Davis Studios at the National Press Foundation. Today we're talking about sexual harassment in our own journalism community and how newsrooms should handle it.
The National Press Foundation is a nonprofit dedicated to helping journalists cover complex topics with depth and accuracy. We serve journalists in the U.S. and around the world.
I'm Sandy Johnson, President of the National Press Foundation. With me in the studio today are three respected journalism veterans: Carrie Budoff Brown, editor of Politico; Loren Mayor, Chief Operating Officer of NPR; and Joanne Lipman, former editor-in-chief of USA Today and author of a very timely book, That's What She Said: What Men Need to Know and Women Need to Tell Them About Working Together. So welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good to be here.
So I thought we'd set the stage by talking about this Columbia Journalism Review self-reported survey, not scientific, about sexual harassment in newsrooms. More than 300 people responded, and 41% said they had been subjected to harassment in their own newsrooms. So is the culture of newsrooms a problem?
Loren, I think Loren's best equipped to answer that question.
I don't think that the culture of newsrooms is a problem. I think that there are certainly dynamics in a newsroom that have sort of historically been there, where people are it's fast-paced, high pressure. You have to get the story out, which can mean that there's not always time for a lot of niceties, and that can contribute to negative behavior. But I think it's a manageable thing. I don't think it's an inherent problem in newsrooms.
Yeah, I think what we need to remember is newsrooms are historically have been it's a very male kind of environment. So, and even now, I mean, the latest research shows that 2/3 of college graduates with journalism or mass communications degrees are female, but only 1/3 of newsroom personnel are female. And then if you look at the senior ranks, the latest figure I heard was 17% of senior newsroom leaders are female. So you've got a very heavily male-influenced environment. And, a lot of women who came up, certainly when I came up, a couple decades ago, the women we were tougher than the guys. Like, that's what we needed to do to fit in. We were entering a male-dominated world, and we just wanted to fit in. So we were tough too, but I do think that harassment piece of it encompasses a lot. So I think there's a question about what people think about as harassment. There's sexual harassment. There's the really bad stuff that people should go to jail for, but then there's the everyday stuff that women encounter 100 times a day, every day. The things like being marginalized, interrupted, overlooked, paid less than their male colleagues. And those things are very, very real and affect virtually all women in newsrooms.
Carrie?
I wouldn't add that much. I mean, I think on one hand, newsrooms can be really, really good places for women. I mean, I think most newsrooms or the newsrooms that I've been lucky enough to come up through, were meritocracies, right? If you worked really hard, you did good work, you could excel. But I think to both the point of Loren and Joanne, there's, Politico is I often say it in speeches that Politico at its beginning was like a tech startup. It's energizing, high pressure, and also male-dominated. That creates certain challenges for women. I faced it myself. Now that I'm in charge of the newsroom, I'm very conscious of where we are and then where we're going. But it is the stuff that just can feel normal in a lot of environments. And I don't think it's really any different than a lot of workplaces these days.
And if I could add something, I've thought a lot about sort of what leads to harassment. And ultimately, it's so much about power dynamics and who has the power and who doesn't. And not just in newsrooms, but in cultures where power is sort of heightened in certain areas because you have talent who is responsible for a show and the whole economics around that show, or editors or star reporters. All those power dynamics can play into what the culture is, and they can start in a healthy way, which is you want the talent to get what they need and have what's important to them, but that can sort of go down a negative path if you're not careful.
And also the power piece is very also tied into the pay piece, right? So you've got not only men in leadership, but men and women who are in similar roles, there's still a real gender pay gap. I mean, from just a couple of years ago, the Wall Street Journal's union did a survey and found that women in the newsroom were being paid 85 cents on the dollar with comparable men. Washington Post at the same time, I think it was 83 cents on the dollar. So there's still this pay gap that we haven't yet closed. It's narrower than it was, but it's still there.
And I think it feels like we would all recognize true sexual assault. I mean, some of the more high-profile cases that came to light. But it's these gray areas, the unwanted comments, the bullying, the flirting that sometimes goes on in newsrooms. You know, does that create, can that create a negative environment and almost promote bad behavior?
I think that's one of the things that I've learned over the last 18 months, and really in particular since, you know, there's an intense focus on this last fall. It's just that newsrooms also, like you said in the introduction, or somebody said here, is that newsrooms are places where people say silly things out loud that can be misinterpreted or not meant in the way that it sounds if you looked at it on paper. And so just the conversation in this day and age with covering Donald Trump and a lot of the rhetoric and the comments that the president himself makes, the stories that we write about the president because of tapes and Stormy Daniels, and there's a lot of like salty talk that just emanates from the news itself, and that when you have a pod of editors sitting around having like conversations and they can descend into silliness or joking, the outer ring of people listening to that conversation, that has an impact. You know, that we have to be very conscious of the conversations we're having. Like, we cannot assume that it's in a newsroom, it's okay. Not in this environment, in my view. And it doesn't mean that we're asking people to be like completely different, you know, people, but like we have to be very conscious of just the jokes that we make in newsrooms these days. It's just, it does not, that in some ways that's grounded in like the news, right? But you can't do that anymore. It's not acceptable.
You know, there's another subtle dynamic that is, it's more of the unconscious bias, which is, and I've seen this very often, and I've felt it very often in my career, which is, in a newsroom, in a news environment, very often the worst thing you can say to somebody is, everybody knows that, or that's a ridiculous idea, right? And you do see women getting shut down more than men. And so you see women who are, first of all, in a news meeting, more reluctant than men to speak up, and more likely to be either interrupted, ignored, or shouted down, or the thing that happens to every single woman everywhere, which is you mention something, you have an idea for a story, nobody hears it, and then 2 minutes later, the guy sitting next to you says exactly the same thing, and suddenly it's his idea and he gets the credit.
I do think that the norms are changing and need to change. We just took our staff through in-person anti-harassment training, which was, I thought, very good. And one of the things that the trainers talked about was that intention doesn't matter. Right, it's how it gets received. So a lot of people who think of themselves as well-meaning will say, well, I didn't mean for that, and you were laughing with me, so it's fine. But part of what I think we need to realize is, even if you were laughing, maybe you didn't think it was funny, but if I'm your boss, you're not going to tell me that it's not funny, and somebody down the hall might have heard it and been really offended by it. And so we really do need to think in all the ways about how we define our culture.
It goes back to the power dynamics you were talking about.
Yeah, so let's move forward from from the newsroom culture. Do you have a code of conduct or a staff handbook? I mean, have you had those at the places that you've worked at, and does anybody read them?
We require it by virtue of them. We were talking about this yesterday in the context of another policy we're looking to write. It's just when you write policies, how do you then get people to understand it and then abide by it, right? I think we have a requirement that everyone signs it. Not everybody does, but by condition of them being employed, they understand the handbook. But that is a challenge. I think it's important to get these things down in writing. I think it's important to establish a baseline, and if you don't have it, you should do it. And yes, require everyone to sign and read.
Is there a section in there on newsroom behavior or ethics or sexual harassment?
We absolutely have those documents, and we've had them for a long time. I think it's partially, making sure that everybody has read them and knows that they have meaning and they have value. One of the things I found at NPR is that if you ask anybody what our journalistic standards are, they can tell you. They absolutely know, and they live those standards every day. We have a standards and practices editor who writes about what it means to sort of do journalism with integrity, and people feel a lot of pride about that. But if you ask people what are our behavioral cultural values, they'd have a much harder time sort of saying those as clearly.
Loren, you said that all former processes and functions need to be reviewed. So everything that an organization thought they had in place needs to be looked at anew. Is it?
You know, at NPR we had a very acute sexual harassment crisis in the fall, and it really caused us to take a very hard look at ourselves and say, you know, we really want to understand how this happened, because there were a few specific incidents, but it exposed broader cultural issues that we were grappling with. And so we had a code of conduct, we had a handbook, but people felt like they didn't know where to go, or they didn't, you know, they didn't believe that they would be listened to if they did. And so really understanding what are the processes, are we communicating about them, how do we live those values in a more aggressive way, I think is important.
I do think that most places need to review most places will have a code of conduct already, but probably need to review, because most of the codes of conduct that the organizations where I've worked have been really, you know, no insider trading, it's really about the journalistic values, to your point. It's about the journalistic values, less about personal behavioral values and where do we stand and how do we act. And you know, we started down that path with social media where we had to put guidelines around and guardrails around social media and what people could, how they could present themselves personally. But we've now, I think, got to take that next step in the wake of the sexual harassment accusations.
And I think all those things, they're cultural artifacts of the moment they were written. So we had a whistleblower hotline. It was defined in our handbook as really being about financial impropriety. And so, you know, it was an easy change to say this is, you know, an anonymous hotline for all issues, and we opened it up and we made sure that people on the phone were trained for that. But I'm sure that when it got developed, that was the issue of the day, and you know, whoever made that policy when they did thought that's the problem they were solving.
But the point that you're getting to, I think, is a really important one, which is if someone feels that they are being sexually harassed, who do they go to? And very often the person who is harassing them is if either a supervisor or someone who's in a small newsroom, let's say, who knows that they'll be found out if they go and lodge any kind of complaint. And so it's a very, very difficult situation in a newsroom to do that.
Yeah, I mean, almost none of the cases that I've dealt with have come in through the front door of HR. You know, it's there are people who are seen in the newsroom as like 2 or 3 steps removed from me and my level, and then, you know, it filters out from there. And so we've done the similar thing where after a couple of, you know, incidents with us, not just sexual harassment, just sort of other concerns that have arisen in our newsroom, the concern about having a non-official channel, even though it is official, but an anonymous outlet, you know, for people to express, you know, concerns about an issue that they see in the newsroom, that they don't want to walk into my office. I always say I have a, you know, open door policy, but it's intimidating, as I've learned, for people to walk into my office and tell me, or to tell my deputies. And so I think you need to have a number of different ways for people to deal with these issues.
But the really important thing for everybody who's listening today is you do need to tell someone. I've been in the position before where someone has come to me who is not in my direct line of report, who works in the company but not for me, because they're afraid to go to their own supervisor, and so they've viewed me as a simpatico ear. And in most cases where that has happened, it turns out the person that they are talking about, there are other complaints against them. And so most people who have been subjected to harassment, and this goes for men, women, whoever, who's been subjected to harassment, most people think it's just them and it is their problem alone, and it is almost never their problem alone. If there's a harasser, there's more than one victim. So it's so important for people to come forward to someone, to find an ally, whether or not it's even in your own department.
I feel like one of the main things I certainly learned in the last few months is just the importance of patterns. You know, that if this behavior exists, it's probably not a one-off.
Right.
And so really being able to understand that and deal with it.
So you mentioned your anonymous hotline. What do you have at Politico?
We have a anonymous feedback form or inbox that people can do it electronically, and that's how we've stood that up just only recently. That, you know, yes, the challenge of sort of having an idea and then executing on it with all the parameters you have to consider. And is it the best way? And I don't know if it really is from my VP of HR. Like, I don't think they really love the anonymous tip line kind of thing, because they want actionable material if they're seeing a behavior that's unacceptable. Like, you don't want to know and then be hamstrung. And that's happened to me as well in the last few months, is that you hear about things and then you trace it back to the source and try to get that person to talk, and if they're not willing to do that, you're stuck. And I understand that frustration, but I think we feel it's important in this environment for people to feel like for our employees to feel like they have an outlet, and we'll try to figure it out. We are reporters after all.
Do you think that's unique to newsrooms, the suck it up, you know, that this, I can't complain about this, it's going to hurt my career?
Doubtful.
I don't think. I don't think that. I do think there's a generational divide, though, and I do see that when I'm going out and speaking with people about. That's what she said. You will see younger women have much lower tolerance. And I think younger women are much angrier. I think they feel like they've grown up in an equal world. Women now are almost 60% of graduates, class of 2018. So they've had leadership roles. They're in the majority. They have excelled. They grew up in a world where their parents certainly told them we're in an equal world. Then they get into the real world and they run smack into this sort of wall of institutional sexism that still exists in not just newsrooms but in organizations. And they're really mad. And they're mad at people like us, like, why didn't you fix this already? Right?
Absolutely.
Whereas older women, actually I did a conversation, and this was with communications lawyers, and one of the women came up to me who was probably around my age, and she said, we are the suck it up generation. Like, stuff happens, we just dealt with it. Yeah.
And so someone actually comes forward and says, I've been harassed or, you know, bullied or what have you. What is the process next? I mean, what should happen next?
Well, in our organization, I mean, one of the things that we've done is we've created a director of compliance position. It's somebody who was in our legal team, but in this function reports directly to the CEO. And part of the goal of having one place where everything flows up is that we sort of collect everything, and he can help make sure that it goes to the right place. I think when there is an issue, you have to do some kind of intake/evaluation of what it is. And one of the ways we've been thinking about what you do then with that information is does this fall as a harassment requiring disciplinary action and investigation? Or is this more of a developmental issue? Some people are not great managers and may not express themselves in the right way, but it falls short of harassment. It requires action, but we think about that as it requires action with their manager and HR to really improve the situation. Some things we feel like harassment, and that requires a more thorough investigation. Where you actually talk to the people involved, try to identify other people who might have information about the situation, put together sort of a document, and then figure out what the right disciplinary course of action is. So we tend to split things into one of those two channels. But fundamentally, at least what I keep saying in our organization is this has to be a place where everybody feels safe and valued. And if you have a concern of any kind, I'd much rather people come forward and talk about it and feel like they can do that in a safe way that's not going to have negative repercussions on their career, so that we can address any issue. But getting people to come forward and to believe, you have to really demonstrate that when we see something inappropriate, we're going to do something about it. Otherwise, you don't build that trust.
And I think that's what we found out from many of the media examples and from the sexual harassment news that has come out over the last few months, is that some women went to their supervisors or went to someone and there was no action. So do you the organizations that you've worked for, and you just spoke to NPR, do they have processes in place that will ensure that there is an evaluation or a review?
I see organizations changing in that way. In the past, you had people who were well-known scoundrels, right? They were given a pass. They were stars, and so they were given a pass. And so we've heard a number of examples of that, and certainly we heard that with situations like with Matt Lauer and Charlie Rose, where people knew So there's not a tolerance for that behavior any longer, and I think that's a positive.
Yeah, you know, for us, just in terms of the process, I mean, I view it in the same way Loren does. If it's an issue of sexual harassment, like I get HR involved from the start, because that's a very, very serious thing. We have other cases of the bullying, the bad management, and that's in my view, an editorial plus HR sort of conversation that we have dealing with managers who are not good managers. You know, what we learned, or what we've, you know, sort of the big message that we delivered to our editors is that, you know, when you really have, if you hear something, you have to, you see it, say it, whatever the phrases you use for the Metro on terrorism. Like, it is absolutely imperative that you speak up, you know, or communicate it to one of us in some way, you know, at a higher level. It's just, and so setting that expectation through the training or however you would do it as newsroom leaders, I think is really important. And I even think, like, right now, we did that 6 months ago. It's probably important that we figure out a way to regularly remind managers that they have an obligation or to say something, you know, because I can't solve problems I don't know about, right? I like to think I have a pulse on a newsroom, but you really need to hammer that away.
I also think you need to make sure everybody has the right kind of support and tools available. So I want everybody in the organization to feel safe coming forward. I want them to know what the paths are. I want them to understand that. I also want managers to feel supported. I want them to not walk around on eggshells. I want to make sure that if there are training needs, that they're given and that that's seen as a positive and constructive thing, so that we're trying to sort of come at this from every angle, because we need everybody in the newsroom to be really working together in the team sport that's journalism. I
do think a lot of what we're talking about, though, and a lot of what people are experiencing falls short of the sexual assault, the truly heinous sexual harassment. And I think that's where we're really in a gray area. That's where managers need training, managers really need awareness. We were talking before the camera went on about research that shows that women are interrupted 3 times more frequently than men. And anyone who's ever been in a news meeting knows that. But men are generally not aware of it. Men are generally, even now, the people who more frequently are the ones who are holding the meeting. And so, you know, we need managers, male and female managers both, to be aware that if there's a woman who is being talked over, not heard, interrupted, to listen for that, because you're not going to hear it unless you actively listen for it and are aware of it.
Let's talk about some of the training that you have encountered in recent months or just during the course of your careers that you thought was helpful in terms of tamping down some of this sexual harassment and, you know, general bad behavior.
I can speak to some. We just went through some anti-harassment training, and actually what was very useful about it was there were great facilitators in person. They were pretty small rooms with a mixed group. And they went through specific scenarios. And we talked about sort of where does this fall in the appropriate, not appropriate, you know, lens. And there are some things that are clearly bad and illegal and heinous, and that's easy. There's a lot of things that when you just read the scenario, they're pretty gray. You might originally think like, oh, that's terrible, and then you start talking through, well, what if these circumstances were at play, or what if this relationship was going on? And you realize it's a lot harder to sort of peel back some of these, and that was very helpful, I think, all around, just to recognize these are complicated issues. One of the great things about journalists is that they know how to take complicated issues and dig into them, and when you can have a conversation like that, you can, I think, get to someplace that's much more constructive.
Do you feel like you came to solutions when you did that? Because if you have those sort of ambiguous scenarios where you can debate it either way, did you find that the training helped you say, okay, if this were to happen, here's how I would actually act?
So I think it helped in 2 ways. One, it was very clear that if this happened and you're a supervisor, you have to take action. There were a lot of people who were like, well, they told me not to tell anybody, so I just sit on it. And that, if you're in a supervisor role, your responsibility is to do something. So it was helpful in that way. The other thing that we did, which sounds very cheesy, and I was pretty anxious about, because journalists don't like cheesy at all, was the trainers actually sort of put up this rope that was green, yellow, and red, and we talked about the scenarios, and then we put them in their places, and I was like, oh, this is not going to go well. This is not, but actually, honest, it's a useful shorthand after you leave that room. You do hear people say, like, that was a little yellow.
Yeah.
So
You know,
green, yellow, red, as in stop.
Like green is
Caution,
fine. That's
go,
totally
yeah.
appropriate behavior. No worries. Red, like, like.
Yeah.
But the yellow, depending on the circumstances, it's just a little gray. And it has given us a very simple shorthand. Now, if you were talking to 20 of the journalists from our organization, I don't know that they'd give you the same response. They might all be much more skeptical. But it has been just an easy way to frame some of these issues without having to sort of go.
So it helps frame them, but this is what I'm really actually have been digging into myself is when you're in the yellow, we're in yellow, what's the advice? What are you supposed to do? And I think that's where we run into trouble, because red is pretty clear, right? And green, we can probably get a good handle on that. The yellow's where a lot of people have gotten into trouble, a lot of organizations.
And is yellow the area where it's incumbent on the individual to say, stop it, forget it, go away, don't do that? Where does the personal responsibility come in, and the sort of management or cultural?
I think these are gray, so I don't know. I feel like
They're yellow.
exactly. Right. I think a lot about power dynamics, and I think I try to imagine, what does the person with the least amount of power in this situation, how do they feel? If they feel uncomfortable in this meeting, could they just get up and walk away? And if the answer is no, that's a problem. And as somebody who does sit with power in the organization, I don't think it should be on the backs of the people with the least amount of power to do the hardest work. I think they should feel safe and encouraged to do that, but I think it has to come from the top. I think there have to be clear cultural values about what's important. There have to be channels where people know that they can go. And then ideally, you have to have that information, otherwise you don't know what's happening. But I think to say, oh, it's a bottoms up thing, I think that's kind of the world we were in before, where there were women who knew things were wrong, who talked to each other, who never brought it up because they knew nothing was going to happen. And
they would tip each other off, like beware of Senator so-and-so or that editor over there, Just don't get in the elevator with them. In terms of the disciplinary process for the perpetrators, we saw many of the harassers were summarily fired. Some were put on leave. Some stayed in their jobs while an investigation went on. Do you have any guidance on when do you do when is it firing offense versus we're going to investigate this and maybe take you off your beat for a week while we do that?
I mean, it's so dependent on the situation and on the what is the complaint and how heinous is the complaint. I think it is. That is really a case by case basis. And I do think there's a fear among men that they will be falsely accused and lose their jobs. We have not seen a lot of that, and we've seen a lot more women who have lost opportunities because they've left the business or have been penalized for reporting someone. So we don't see a lot of that.
I mean, our first bar is safety. So if a concern came forward and we felt like having that person, everybody deserves an investigation, right? But if we felt that having that person in the organization in that chair was going to have a negative impact on sort of the safety and security, that would be a reason to make a change. It might be about, but it is very, very case by case, and I think that's what managers have to do. One of the things that was something our organization just grappled with is journalists want to know the truth. They want to know everything. They want to know every fact. That's in the DNA. That's why they're so great at their jobs. And when it comes to personnel issues, how do you balance transparency, which is what people want in their organization, and privacy, which is when you say to somebody, if somebody made an accusation against you that was perhaps unsubstantiated, would you want me to tell the entire company before we had done anything? You probably wouldn't. And yet wearing your journalism hat, you want to know. And so that push and pull, I don't know if you guys have experienced it, but that is very, very challenging to navigate.
You know, the newsrooms always seem to expect like a note from me, like if something happens, and it's, you know, they want it explained, and I tend to deal with it obviously on a case-by-case basis. I say that we can come and talk, you know, but you're limited. You know, you're limited. It's a personnel issue. It's a legal issue. Like, I want to tell everybody what I know. That's also my nature as a journalist, is that I do want to tell you. I want to tell you what happened, and that's you know, that's an additional complication with being in a newsroom and dealing with these issues, that everyone thinks they have a right to know what happened, how it happened. And that's a challenge as a newsroom leader, I think.
I think part of the reason for that, though, is that some organizations, including NPR, were so transparent. And then when the investigation was finished, you know, there was a lengthy report that we all read. And other organizations, not so much. You know, the person went back to his beat, or he disappeared. And I guess that is probably internal, you know, HR that sways that.
And legal.
And
legal,
lawyers are a big part of it. It feels like,
Right. Another point that we want to make is that each organization has to be clear about their values, and I think that's a really valid point. And but what does that mean? Does an organization actually have values, and how do you get those across to the staff?
I think that's really key. I mean, one of the exercises we've gone through in the last 18 months is, in particular this year, sort of crystallized this year, where we set out like 5, you know, company goals that deal with, you know, product and this and that and all that kind of stuff. But the 5th was about culture, and the culture that we demand from, or the one that we're setting, and then the behavior we demand in return from our company. It's collaboration, respect, you know, along those lines, collaborative, respectful, and setting that. And we made a big deal out of that. Like, we huddled as executives and did this, and then we had a big, you know, sort of town hall thing. We've amplified then that throughout these past 6 months, and that was a real break for us at Politico to do something like that. The expectation is that you're respectful to each other, and you support each other, and you're collaborative, and that's our expectation as, you know, a company, as leaders. We try to model that behavior. And I think that's important. I mean, it might, you know, some people roll their eyes, journalists roll their eyes at, you know, mission statements or like cultural values, but I think that's really important to set that expectation. And by no means does everyone follow that, right? But it gives me a starting point to demand that, and if they step out, if they don't live by that, a premise to call them out on that. And I think, you know, that is part of who we are now at Politico.
It does go back to the beginning of our conversation where we were talking about rules. Like, you need very clear rules, and then everybody has to live by the rules. There was a huge debate last week. It wasn't in journalism. It was about the CEO of Intel who lost his job. He was doing a great job as CEO, but he had a relationship with someone that was against the rules, to have a relationship with a subordinate, and he was fired for it. There was a huge debate. Well, it was a consensual relationship, so why should he be fired? Well, he should be fired because that's the rule. He knew what the rule was, he broke the rule. And so it makes it a lot easier when you have, you know, very, very crystal clear guidelines. And by the way, that dating in the newsroom also, look, I mean, I was, the Intel situation, I was on CNBC on Power Lunch talking about it with the anchor of Power Lunch, who said, "Hey, I met my wife; she was my producer." Right. So there's a lot of newsroom relationships. So you want to make sure you're careful about that too. I mean, in my experience, what I've asked is that if there's a newsroom relationship, that is reported immediately to a supervisor, so that it's you know, particularly if it is if there's a situation where somebody's reporting to somebody else.
What about not reporting, just like 2 reporters who are like 25 years old?
Yeah, not so much.
Okay.
Not so much. No, I mean, honestly. But it's if you're in a supervisory position and you're dating somebody who's junior, you know, there needs to be sort of, here's what the expectation is, here's what the guideline is, and if you violate it, here's what the consequences are.
Yep.
It is also useful to know, getting back to that point of intent, even if it's not, I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with it, but I think it's useful for somebody to have some knowledge about it, because people might be treated differently, or there might be the perception that somebody's treated differently because of a relationship, and so it can be helpful to at least understand those dynamics.
All goes back to power, like you said.
You raised the point about values, and I would just say, any journalism organization, I think if you asked, do you have journalistic values, they would say yes, and they would tell you what they are, and they wouldn't think twice, and they wouldn't think that that was corny, right? And I think if you don't have if you don't have stated values, you still have values. People know what they are, and if they're not stated, they might be quite negative. I mean, if there are modes of behavior that are just accepted, that is the value of your organization, whether you want it to be or not. And so I think it's really important to clearly identify what you do want, so that you can reward those behaviors, incent those behaviors, talk about them.
Carrie, when you said that Politico has these 5 corporate goals or company goals, is this the first time that behavior has been part of that?
Absolutely.
So that's a huge change, right?
It was. I mean, we're a young organization, 11, 12 years old, flew by the seat of our pants for many years, and so this is, the first time where we've had, spelling out exactly like the behavioral expectation of everybody in the company. Yes.
And I think that's great that, that you have done that, and that NPR is doing all of this training, and other organizations are too. But how do you enforce that every day, day in and day out? What pressure cookers newsrooms are, and how do you make sure that everybody knows that every single day, sort of putting it, at the top of every
I think
budget, story budget, or
well, I have I think it comes from the top, and I have had teams of reporters in the newsroom that when they're not when they're not treating each other well, I personally intervene in a lot of ways. Like oftentimes I have some high-profile beats in my newsroom, type A personalities, competitive environment, behaviors that I don't find acceptable. I make clear that I don't find it acceptable through personal conversations with people. I view it as a negative. Very clear. I say this in actually, I talk to the newsroom about every 6 weeks. I probably should do it more. But I almost always make a statement about my desire to have people be collaborative and supportive of each other, and I look very dimly upon people who don't. And so I think, and then my immediate circle of editors who I spend the most time with, like, I think we're a pretty collaborative, supportive group of people. Like, I love the qualities of the people I've brought around me. And I think that's important, because I would say, your team is fighting, but you need to look at like the senior leaders, editors in this newsroom who like don't fight that way. Like, that is not the behavior that's acceptable here. And so I think that's one piece of it. I think constantly reinforcing that with the help of HR, where we do these sort of events or things. We have a wall where people write, I'm collaborative because, and we sort of write that up. So we have sort of these sort of reminder events, which is helpful when you have a really great HR department. But I think day to day, like I've said before publicly that I have like a no asshole rule, which I believe in, but I've also been called out for that, because I don't have a newsroom free of assholes either, and so. That is, I understand that, and I don't proclaim to have a newsroom free of assholes. But when I see behavior that I find abhorrent, because the person's yelling at another reporter, like, I will go directly to that person and say, that is not the way we behave here. And so I think that's important.
Can I just second that? That I've always had a no asshole rule, and I've never quite gotten there. I mean, journalists,
you can't.
Just great journalists sometimes have difficult personalities. But I think the leadership piece is so important. The leadership has to model the behavior. One of the things that actually I did myself, I changed my own leadership style while I was reporting. That's what she said. One of the things that I learned is, when you have an opening, I think all of us know at this point that you should have a diverse slate of candidates. But what I learned in the reporting was that it's not sufficient to have a diverse slate of candidates. You actually need a diverse slate of interviewers. So I made sure, so my own team at USA Today Network was a very, we had a mix of genders, ethnicity, sexuality, and it was terrific, because then when we had people coming in, I made sure that it wasn't just a homogeneous group of people interviewing. You get different feedback, and frankly, if you have just a homogeneous group doing the interviewing, you miss really great candidates, because everyone is drawn to people who remind them of themselves.
Interesting. Joanne, from your research, does it make a difference if leadership from the top. I mean, what like Carrie is demonstrating. Does it make a difference in a newsroom?
It makes a huge difference, and it's not just at the editor-in-chief level, though of course that's incredibly important, but it is at the corporate level. And this is something that I see way too few organizations, not just news organizations, but just way too few organizations of all sorts have the CEO and the CFO involved. So you need the CEO who really sets the culture, because no matter how great your HR department is, they do not set the culture. The leadership does. And the CFO, because every single piece of research will show you that if you have a diverse group of workers and a diverse leadership team, that your results are better, that you're more successful, you're more creative, you're better at problem solving, and your financial results by pretty much every single measure are better when you have a diverse group. So you need your CFO you need CEO, CFO to own it. And in way too many organizations, it is delegated to HR. And HR, no matter how great they are, without the backing and the modeling at the top, they cannot change the culture.
I want to speak out on behalf of smaller newsrooms around the country, and Lord knows they're getting smaller and smaller. Not everyone has a big HR operation that can sort of step in and do an investigation. And I wonder if that stops some people from coming forward if they know they simply have to go to somebody else in the newsroom. Do you have any advice for newsrooms that simply do not have HR capacity?
Joanne, you probably dealt with this at the network, right?
Yeah,
you have smaller papers,
we had
right?
smaller papers that we laddered up to a corporate HR. But I will say that in the organizations that I've seen and that I've worked with, that the key thing is not, and one thing I have seen that is like a don't, is when there's hardly any senior women there, they just pick the senior women and say, oh, you're the senior woman, you deal with it, which is like totally wrong, like not the way to go, right? I would say to the person who is being harassed is it is essential to find an ally, and that ally may not be HR, you may not have HR, and it may not be your supervisor, and it may not be in your department. And that's what I was referring to earlier. It could be somebody in the ad sales side who you have a relationship with. It could be someone, you need to find, there needs to be someone who you can confide in, preferably somebody who has more power than you do, who can navigate the situation and help you navigate, give you advice, but also help be a champion for you and navigate. And because that's why I say, like in these organizations, it's very, very rare that somebody who's being harassed, that they are the only victim.
And Loren, NPR is so, I mean, you're dispersed all over the world. You've got newsrooms everywhere. How do you enforce that value in San Francisco, in London, and places where you are not, and the leadership is not?
Yeah, that's a good question. We have some bureaus that are a little bit larger, and they tend to have a little bit of their own culture. Sometimes they're very happy to have a culture that isn't headquarters. They take a lot of pride in being a little different. I think you still want strong heads of those organizations who feel connected into sort of, the broader corporation, who understand what those values are and who can create those pathways for people. It is very challenging. We have a lot of, bureaus which are one person or one staff member who's working with somebody in the country. And so that is really hard if you are on the other end of the world and you're just connected to a phone line. To feel that you have trust in the organization and connected is a real challenge. It's something that we are grappling with. If I could go back to your question about smaller newsrooms, I have no idea if this is going to work. But I will share that one of the things, an idea that came up out of our organization sort of when we were really in the thick of things, was the notion of a peer-to-peer support group. And the idea was that there are trusted people in the organization who weren't necessarily HR, who weren't necessarily the big boss, but that people did believe in and go to. And if there was a little bit of a way to sort of identify those nodes across the organization, give those people more training so that they knew what to do, and to create some clearer pathways, both to from people in the organization to those nodes, and from those people kind of through the formal process. The hope is that will help as well, that you might not feel comfortable going to your boss, but you might well feel comfortable going to somebody else. And this isn't for the things that are truly heinous, but sometimes people have questions about the gray areas or the yellow thing, which is like, somebody made this comment and it made me really uncomfortable. What do I do? Is that a reportable offense? I don't want to get anybody in trouble. And just having somebody that you can talk that through with seems like that could be really helpful. And one of the things, and we're just designing this now, so I don't know how it will work, is the person in that network might hear that concern and say, that doesn't seem like you need to report that. You know, why don't you talk to your manager? Here are some things you could do. But they will be keeping an inventory of those things so that if 2 more people come to them with a similar kind of complaint that seems low level, that's how we can ideally start to identify these patterns and know that maybe there's something much more significant there. So
I think that's a smart idea. I mean, we even have that in our own newsroom. There are editors who are deputy editors, two steps removed from me, and they're identified internally as sort of leaders on these issues of like recruitment, diversity, just sort of connected to the newsroom in a way. It's not even their formal job, right? They've taken on these responsibilities, and I've seen it that people have gravitated to these editors when there's an issue that they want to take out of their own chain of command or whatever and get some advice. And I think that's a really important outlet to have in addition to these other things we're talking about.
I had a deputy who was in charge of corrections, but also was involved in diversity recruitment and became a person. He was one of my direct reports who became someone who was just a trusted ear, who people, if they had concerns, could come, a relationship or any kind of issues, interpersonal relationships in the office could go to. And I think that is really important to have identified those people.
And for managers in these smaller newsrooms, in recent months, have you come across resources that you think would be valuable for them along these lines? In the case of you two, do your organizations post these documents on your website? The cultural values, the handbook, the employee handbook, those things.
We definitely have an internal hub that has all of this stuff in it. That people actually have a reason. It's better now that we have a highly functioning HR department where there's lots of different materials there that force them to go to this site for various things. So that is one way that we have it. But
not for outsiders.
No, not for outsiders.
Is NPR's available?
We certainly have an internal intranet where all of these things are. We've tried to do a lot of this in public, so I would have to double check. I don't think there's much that we're doing that we wouldn't share. I do think that, in some ways you have to take the values and make them your own. I mean, I was listening to you. Ours are pretty similar about respect and striving for excellence. I mean, in some ways they're platitudes. It's about how you make, turn them into something real in your organization.
And Joanne, from your research for your book, did you come across things that were just obvious things that every newsroom manager should have in their arsenal?
So I actually teased, so in the book I tell a lot of stories of, and I interview primarily men who are in leadership positions, and some of it took place in newsrooms, who are trying to close the gender gap. And then I glean from them sort of the lessons that they learned and tactics that they had come up with. So I actually put, at the end of the book, I put a cheat sheet, a dozen things you can do right now to help close the gender gap at work. And for the paperback, which actually I'm doing some revisions and adding more because it's that part has been very, very popular. So I'm adding some more sort of, action items that you can actually do and put into place.
And this actually came from Joanne when we were putting together an outline for this seminar, or webinar rather. Does the gender imbalance in newsrooms impact, first of all, harassment and disrespect toward female journalists?
I think it does. Totally. I do. Joanne, do you have an answer? I mean, I feel like it does. Like half my senior leadership of the newsroom are women, and half of our leadership of our company now are women. So that's like a huge change for us. And I really think it has a direct impact on the policies we choose to pursue and the tone we set. We're just different than men.
Oh, well, with 100%, but I would go further than that and say it impacts news coverage. And
Yes,
I have
well,
a,
yes.
I have
Second
a,
part, right? Yeah.
yes, I have a real issue with the fact that we have been so male-dominated for so long. If you think about it, so we as the news media, we are the prism through which society views itself. And when you have that prism that has been pretty much white guys, it actually impacts what we view as news and what we view as important and what we view as trivial. And I think the best example is actually the one we're talking about right now, which is sexual harassment. So if you think about it, all power to the reporters at the New York Times and the New Yorker for breaking the Harvey Weinstein story almost a year ago at this point. But I give a lot of credit as well to their editors, and particularly at the Times. If you look at the way the Harvey Weinstein story was played in print, it was page one above the fold. Now that sends a message. That sends a message that says this is a serious story about systemic abuse by a powerful individual against women, as opposed to how these stories have played out in the past, which is as lightweight sex scandals. I mean, think about how you read about, learned about, heard about the Bill Cosby case. It's exactly the same story. It's a powerful man in the entertainment industry accused of sexually assaulting dozens of women. It's exactly the same story, but that played out as a tabloid story, a sex scandal. It didn't get the same level of serious import, and there wasn't a recognition that it was emblematic of a larger systemic societal issue. It was sort of a one-off. And I think that's when you have diversity in the newsroom, you have a sense, wait a second, this is a big, major issue for society as opposed to something trivial. I even heard just last week, I heard somebody referring to the situation with the children being put in the internment camps as a women's issue, which I was like, how is that a women's issue? Right, so it's so important to have that diversity so that we can understand so we're making the calls about what counts and what we need to care about. So yeah, it really makes an impact.
Any final thoughts?
I mean, I would just echo I think the crux of it is creating an inclusive environment, right? It's not just a diverse environment, but an inclusive one. And I've learned myself, the difference between diversity and inclusivity is a real thing, right? And bringing in different viewpoints. And I think your tip on hiring and having a diverse group of people interview, that's a fantastic tip that I will take. I've learned that before. I've brought in women as job candidates and unwittingly set them up with 9 out of 10 men, and then they've actually, to her credit, was do women have a place in this? I'm just holy crap. Yes, they do, right? Yeah. But I think, I think the inclusivity thing helps a lot. Creating an environment where people feel supported. They could speak up and not be judged. I know that's hard, but sort of starting from somewhere and creating this environment where people are respected is important.
And the one thing I would add is something that we didn't really discuss, but that is top of mind, particularly for younger people, which is the issue of intersectionality. The idea that, yes, women are at a disadvantage and get paid less, but if you're a woman who belongs to another underrepresented group, that you're facing a double or a triple bind. So that for instance is, women generally make 80 cents on the dollar for men, but for black women it's 64 cents, and for 63 cents on the dollar. For Latina women, 54 cents on the dollar. So there are these additional hurdles for people, and that goes for sexuality, race, gender, ethnicity. And that's something that I find that with younger journalists and younger people generally are highly focused on those nuances, which I think is all to the good. I think that's fantastic, but older managers very often are not. And so it's something that we need to be aware of as the next generation that's coming up now.
The last thing I would say that we didn't talk about explicitly is just how important it is to listen. That's one of the things that really was meaningful for me as all of these issues came forward in the organization, really taking the time and creating forums to let people talk about what was wrong, to not assume that I got it or that it was a smaller issue than it was. That was really powerful and helped, I think helped our organization identify what the real problems are. And it struck me as ironic in some ways. NPR, fundamentally, our mission, we believe that listening changes the world. That's what we believe as our business model. And what really struck me was how true that was inside the organization, that when you take the time to really listen to what people are struggling with, you can identify ways to try to help them. And to your point, even at the smallest news organizations, that's a pretty easy step to just create those forums, to ask the questions, and to really pay attention to the answers.
Terrific. So our thanks again to Carrie Budoff Brown of Politico, Loren Mayor of NPR, and longtime editor and author Joanne Lipman for sharing their experience and expertise on this important issue. Resources from this webinar will be posted for your use on NPF's website at nationalpress.org, where we make good journalists better.